Imagine a time back in the early 1600s when the English settlers had just started to put down roots in what we now call Virginia. They were trying to establish their place in a new world, but they weren't alone. The land was already home to the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful group of over 30 tribes led by Chief Wahunsenacah, who the English simply called Chief Powhatan. When the English first arrived, Chief Powhatan saw an opportunity. He figured these newcomers might make good allies, especially against other threats like the Spanish or rival Native American tribes. But things didn't go as planned. As the English began to settle in, they wanted more land, especially after they discovered how valuable tobacco could be. The settlers' hunger for land grew, and that's where the trouble started. Now, the story of the Anglo-Powhatan Wars isn't just one big battle, it's a series of conflicts that stretched over decades, from 1610 to 1646. Each time, the English managed to push the Powhatans further and further off their own land. It's a tough tale of struggle, loss, and the harsh reality of colonization. The First War kicked off in 1610, right after the English began planting tobacco, which was like gold in the New World. Relations had already soured, and the tension finally boiled over into open conflict. By the time the Third and Final War ended in 1646, the once powerful Powhatan Confederacy had been all but dismantled. Their leader at the time, Chief Opchanacanough, was captured and killed, and his successor, Tsenacommacah, was forced to sign a peace treaty that effectively dissolved the Confederacy. This treaty wasn't just a piece of paper, it marked the end of an era. The land that the Powhatan people had lived on for generations, the land they called Tsenacommacah, was slowly but surely taken from them. What was once a thriving confederacy became just a memory, with the remaining tribes struggling to hold onto what little they had left. But let's take a step back and think about what this land meant to the Powhatans. Tsenacommacah wasn't just a place to live, it was sacred ground. The land was deeply connected to their gods and their ancestors. They believed the land was given to them by Ahone, the creator, and Oak, the helper who was part of their daily lives. The rituals they performed, the crops they grew, even the places where they buried their dead, all of it was tied to this land. It wasn't something they could simply give up. Before the English arrived, the Powhatans had lived in this region for over 12,000 years. They had their own ways of life, their own traditions, and their own relationship with the earth. They knew the rhythms of the land, rotating crops and following the animals they hunted. It was a way of life that had sustained them for centuries. But when the English came, they didn't understand any of this. They saw the land as something to be claimed and exploited, not as a sacred space. They built their colony, Jamestown, in a swampy area that the Powhatans had avoided because it was nearly useless. The English settlers, many of whom were aristocrats who had never worked a day in their lives, quickly found themselves struggling to survive. Disease and starvation took a heavy toll, and the settlers became increasingly desperate. Chief Powhatan, seeing their struggle, provided them with food, but the settlers were not satisfied. They began stealing from the Powhatans, straining the already fragile relationship. Captain John Smith, one of the leaders of the Jamestown colony, tried to keep things under control, even forming an alliance with Chief Powhatan. But despite these efforts, the English continued to push the boundaries, both literally and figuratively. The situation only worsened over time. New arrivals brought more mouths to feed, and with them came a man named John Rolfe, who introduced tobacco farming to the colony. Tobacco quickly became the colony's lifeblood, but it also meant the settlers needed even more land. This relentless expansion fueled further conflict, leading to the outbreak of the first of the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. So, the tensions between the Powhatans and the English settlers didn't take long to escalate into full-blown conflict, and this marked the beginning of the First Powhatan War. Things really heated up when the English leader, West, demanded that the Powhatans return some tools and weapons that had been traded earlier. Chief Wahunsenacah wasn't having it. He told West and his people they should pack up and head back to where they came from. Obviously, this didn't sit well with West, so he ordered his men to strike first. West's forces, led by commanders like Sir Thomas Gates, James Davis, and George Percy, launched brutal attacks on the Powhatan tribes. In one particularly harsh move, Davis and Percy led a raid on the Paspaheghs, burning their capital and killing over 60 people. The violence didn't stop there. They even threw the chief's children overboard during their journey back to Jamestown and executed their mother upon arrival. It was a clear message: the English weren't just looking to coexist, they were ready to take what they wanted by force. Of course, Chief Wahunsenacah wasn't about to back down either. He retaliated, and what followed was a brutal back and forth of raids and counterattacks. This wasn't some traditional war where both sides meet on a battlefield. It was more like guerrilla warfare, with surprise attacks and ambushes becoming the norm. The English, used to more conventional fighting, had to adapt quickly or risk being overrun. As this war dragged on, more and more settlers arrived in Virginia. John Rolfe's successful tobacco crop in 1612 only made things worse, as the demand for land to grow this golden crop kept increasing. Every new plantation meant more land taken from the Powhatans, pushing them further to the brink. But in 1613, something happened that temporarily slowed the conflict. The English, under the command of Sir Samuel Argall, kidnapped Wahunsenacah's daughter, Pocahontas. Argall held her for ransom, demanding that the Powhatans return English prisoners and the tools and weapons West had demanded earlier. Wahunsenacah complied with most of the demands, but Argall refused to release Pocahontas, keeping her as a hostage. During her captivity, Pocahontas was held at Henricus, where she learned English and met John Rolfe. Over time, they grew close, and in April 1614, Pocahontas converted to Christianity, took the name Rebecca, and married Rolfe. This marriage brought about what's known as the Peace of Pocahontas, a brief period from 1614 to 1622 where tensions eased, and the two sides managed to coexist more peacefully. But this peace was fragile. In 1616, Pocahontas, Rolfe, and their young son traveled to England, where they were part of a promotional tour to drum up support for the Virginia colony. Sadly, on the return trip in 1617, Pocahontas fell ill and died. Her death was a significant blow, not just to her family but to the fragile peace she had helped establish. Back in Virginia, Chief Wahunsenacah stepped down, passing leadership to his half-brother, Opchanacanough. Opchanacanough had no intention of letting the English continue their expansion unchecked. He began planning for what would become the Second Powhatan War. In 1622, Opchanacanough launched a massive surprise attack on the English settlers, an event now known as the Indian Massacre of 1622. In a single day, his warriors killed over 300 colonists and destroyed several settlements, sparing Jamestown only because of a last-minute warning from a young Powhatan boy. Opchanacanough hoped this devastating blow would convince the English to stop expanding and leave the Powhatans in peace, but that hope was in vain. Instead of backing off, the English dug in, leading to another long, drawn-out conflict much like the First War. The Powhatans, familiar with the land, were masters of hit-and-run tactics, using their bows and arrows to deadly effect. The English, struggling to defend themselves, turned to trickery in 1623. They lured a Powhatan delegation to a peace meeting, only to poison their drinks and slaughter the unarmed warriors. In the end, the war officially wrapped up in 1626 when Opchanacanough sued for peace, but the scars of these wars ran deep, with hostilities flaring up on and off for years afterward. So, after the Second Powhatan War, the English colonists were determined to avoid any more surprises. To keep the peace, they built a wooden palisade, stretching about 6 miles across the Virginia peninsula. It was essentially a stockade wall, meant to keep the Powhatans at bay. By 1641, William Berkeley had become the governor of Virginia, and he was all about making sure the colony thrived, especially when it came to tobacco. Now, tobacco had really taken off. Thanks to John Rolfe's earlier efforts, it had become Virginia's main cash crop, and the demand for it was skyrocketing. But there was a problem. Tobacco was a backbreaking crop to grow and harvest, so the colonists started bringing in African slaves to work the fields. As more land was needed for tobacco, more plantations sprang up, and the settlers kept pushing further into Powhatan territory. By 1644, the English colonists outnumbered the Powhatans in the region. But even at nearly 90 years old, Opchanacanough wasn't ready to give up. In a last-ditch effort to reclaim his people's land, he gathered every warrior he could and launched one more surprise attack. They broke through the palisade and killed between 400 to 500 colonists in a brutal raid. This marked the start of the Third Powhatan War. Just like before, Opchanacanough didn't follow through with a prolonged attack. Instead, he pulled back to see what the colonists would do. The English, though, were ready. Governor Berkeley led a major offensive against Opchanacanoug's capital in 1645, killing most of his warriors and capturing the chief himself. Opchanacanough was brought back to Jamestown in chains, where he was put on display as a prisoner of war. Despite orders to keep him alive, he was shot in the back by a guard in 1646, marking the end of the Third Powhatan War. With Opchanacanough gone, the English pushed for a formal peace. The Treaty of 1646 was signed between Governor Berkeley and Opchanacanoug's successor, Tsenacommacah. This treaty effectively dissolved the Powhatan Confederacy and handed over most of their lands to the colonists. Tsenacommacah might have been called a chief, but in reality, the Powhatan Confederacy was now just a shadow of what it once was. As time went on, the situation only got worse for the Powhatans. Tsenacommacah was succeeded by Totopotomoy, who was left with only 2 tribes under his control. After his death, his wife, Pocahontas, took over but had even less power, governing just the Pamunkey tribe. Then came Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. This was a violent uprising where both indentured servants and landowners in the interior attacked not only the remaining native villages but also Jamestown itself. The rebellion further decimated the indigenous population. Jamestown was burned, and the colonial government relocated to a place called Middle Plantation, what we now know as Williamsburg. In 1677, the Treaty of Middle Plantation was signed, marking another turning point for the native people. This treaty forced the remaining tribes onto reservations, granting them certain rights like bearing arms, trading, and hunting on their ancestral lands, but only as long as they stayed peaceful. Pocahontas managed to convince the other chiefs to sign, but this meant that the indigenous people were confined to ever-shrinking patches of their own land. Fast forward to today, and only 2 tribes in Virginia, the Mattaponi and Pamunkey, still maintain their original reservations. But their story didn't end with those treaties. In 1924, the Racial Integrity Act tried to erase their identity by classifying everyone in Virginia as either white or colored. The Mattaponi and Pamunkey didn't fit into these categories, but they refused to be erased. They fought for recognition, and by the 1960s, they were officially recognized as Native American tribes by the state of Virginia. However, it wasn't until 2018 that they were finally recognized by the federal government as the original people of Tsenacommacah.